I'd visited Henry's grave every Sunday for 3 years, but that morning, someone had already been there. The words echoed in my head as I stood by the iron gate, the chill of early spring clinging to my coat. I always came at the same hour, carrying the same white chrysanthemums from the same old woman at the corner stall. Ritual made grief predictable, and predictability was the only thing that didn't break me. The gravel crunched beneath my shoes as I walked toward his resting place. It was quiet except for the distant hum of traffic and a single crow calling from the church spire. I could trace the path with my eyes closed, past the yew tree, the cracked stone angel, the bench no one sat on anymore. But that morning, something stopped me cold. There, lying across the grave, was a bouquet of lilies, fresh, white, still damp with dew. My hands froze around the stems of my chrysanthemums. The paper crackled softly, the sound strangely loud against the hush of the cemetery. I hadn't brought lilies since the first year. Henry had hated them, said they smelled too much like hospitals, like endings. I'd buried that scent with him. So who had left these? I knelt slowly, tracing one soft petal with my finger. It was cold, wet, perfect. My throat tightened. The flowers hadn't blown here by accident. They were arranged deliberately, each stem pointing toward the headstone like quiet devotion. Someone had stood here, someone who knew him well enough to bring lilies. I looked around. The cemetery was empty, rows of stone tilting gently beneath the pale sky. Only the wind moved, cool, steady, brushing my hair across my face. The scent of perfume lingered faintly in the air, floral but unfamiliar, and my heart quickened. For the first time in years, I felt like an intruder at his grave. I placed my chrysanthemums beside the lilies, hands shaking, unsure if I was leaving flowers for him or for the ghost of whoever had come before me. I wanted to believe it was kindness, a stranger moved by the name carved into the stone, but my gut whispered otherwise. There was intimacy in the way those lilies rested, intention, memory. I stood there longer than I should have, until the sun began to rise higher, scattering light through the branches. Then, quietly, I said what I always said before leaving. I miss you, Henry, but something's changed. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house felt like footsteps outside, every whisper of wind against the glass, like a knock on the door. I told myself I wouldn't go back, that whoever it was, they had their reasons. But curiosity, when mixed with grief, becomes something else, a pulse you can't silence. So the next morning, I returned. The grass was still wet with mist, and I moved carefully, hiding behind the old oak that leaned near the fence. My breath came in small clouds. I felt foolish, a woman in her 60s crouching behind a tree, spying on the dead. But I couldn't leave without knowing. Minutes passed. Then footsteps, slow, steady, deliberate. She appeared. A woman, perhaps in her late 50s, wearing a long gray coat that brushed the ground. Her hair was tied up, streaked with silver. She carried a small bundle of red roses, the stems wrapped neatly in white ribbon. Her movements were graceful, practiced, almost reverent. She didn't hesitate. She walked straight to Henry's grave. My heart thud. She knelt, brushing away a few leaves that had gathered on the stone. Then she placed the roses exactly where the lilies had been, one by one, with care. Her hand trembled slightly, but not from cold. I tried to see her face, but the brim of her hat shaded it from view. There was something about her posture, though, the way she bowed her head, the quiet way she moved. It wasn't the grief of a stranger. Then she reached into her coat pocket and took out something. Small. The sunlight caught it. Silver, round, a pendant. I froze. I knew that pendant, a tiny compass, no bigger than a coin. Henry's, he used to wear it always, said it kept him from getting lost, even when he wasn't going anywhere. I bought him a replacement after he lost the original years ago, and I remember fastening the new one around his neck before they closed the coffin. But there it was, gleaming between her fingers, or one just like it. She held it to her lips for a moment, eyes closed, as if whispering to him. Then she tucked it back under her coat and rested her palm on the stone. My breath came shallow. Who was she? How could she have that compass? The wind rose, carrying the faintest trace of her perfume, the same scent I'd noticed the day before. It made my stomach twist. I wanted to step out, to confront her, to demand answers. But something in the way she stood, calm, unhurried, almost peaceful, stopped me. She wasn't afraid. If anything, she looked certain. She stayed for a few minutes longer, her fingers brushing the carved letters of Henry's name. Then she straightened, slipped her hands into her coat pockets, and turned away. The sun caught her face for a second. Soft lines, tired eyes, a trace of sadness that mirrored my own. Then she was gone, disappearing down the path that led to the main gate. I stayed hidden until the echo of her steps faded. Then, I walked out from behind the tree and knelt beside the grave again. The roses she'd left were still damp with morning dew. Their color, deep, tender red, looked too alive against the cold marble. I traced one petal, feeling the sting of something I couldn't name. Love, maybe, or betrayal, or both at once. The compass wouldn't leave my mind. If she had it, that meant one of two things. Either she'd taken the original before he got the replacement, or Henry had given her a duplicate. Both possibilities burned. The morning sun had fully broken through now, painting the stones in gold. I stood there for a long time, staring at the roses, at the space she'd occupied moments ago. I whispered, "Who are you?" The air didn't answer. Only the faint perfume lingered, stubborn and sweet. As I turned to leave, I felt the old ache in my chest twist into something sharper. Not just grief anymore, but need. Next Sunday, I'd come earlier. I'd wait. And this time, I wouldn't hide behind the tree. This time, I'd follow her. Curiosity may kill the cat, but grief makes you bold. That was the sentence that wouldn't leave me alone. I said it out loud while buttering my toast, as if hearing it might make it sound less foolish. But there was nothing foolish about the ache sitting in my chest. It pulsed, steady and sharp. Every time I thought of the woman in the gray coat and the way she touched Henry's grave, I tried to convince myself to let it go. People grieve in strange ways. Maybe she had known him once, a neighbor, an old friend, someone he'd helped at the bookstore. Maybe she simply liked lilies, unaware of his distaste for them. But then my mind returned to that silver compass, gleaming like a memory that refused to die. I had buried the replacement compass with him. I remember fastening the chain around his neck myself. The clasp had stuck, it always did, and I'd whispered, "There, now you won't lose your way." I could still feel the cool metal against my fingers. So how could that same compass, or its twin, now hang from a stranger's hand? By the third day, sleep had become a visitor I couldn't entertain. I sat in my chair by the window long after midnight, wrapped in Henry's old sweater, the faint scent of him still clinging to the wool. The world outside was silent, except for the occasional hiss of tires on wet pavement. Inside, the silence was heavier. It's strange how loneliness can sound like breathing, slow, steady, endless. I told myself this wasn't jealousy. I didn't want to compete with her. I just needed to understand the truth. If she had been part of Henry's life, I wanted to know how. I deserved that much. But even as I thought it, I could hear my mother's voice from years ago. "Let sleeping ghosts rest, Eleanor." Only I couldn't, because this ghost had left roses. The next Sunday, I packed my courage like armor. I rose before dawn, dressed in muted colors, and left my phone on the table. I didn't want distractions, only clarity. As I walked toward the cemetery, my hands trembled, not from fear, but anticipation. The sky was gray, the kind that promised rain, but never delivered. I hid again behind the oak, feeling the rough bark against my back. The air smelled of wet grass and earth. And right on time, she came. The same woman, the same coat. But this time, she carried daffodils. I watched as she knelt, brushed the stone clean, and placed the flowers gently. Her movements deliberate and full of care. She whispered something I couldn't hear, then touched the compass beneath her collar as if it were part of her prayer. Something in me shifted. The tenderness in her gesture no longer felt threatening. It felt personal, intimate, full of sorrow. Whoever she was, she carried a burden, too. But my resolve didn't soften. When she turned to leave, I waited a few moments, then followed. Her pace was unhurried. She moved like someone who knew where every crack in the pavement was, as if she'd walked this path 100 times. I kept a careful distance, staying behind parked cars and garden hedges, my heart drumming like it hadn't in years. It felt wrong following her like this, but the pull of curiosity was stronger than guilt. Every step forward felt like trespassing into Henry's secrets. She turned down a narrow lane, lined with terraced houses, the kind built close together, with ivy crawling up their walls. I noted the small things, the worn blue coat with a missing button, the way she paused at crossings, the careful way she avoided puddles. A woman of habit, like me. When she reached the end of the lane, she stopped before a modest brick house with white curtains and flower pots by the steps. She hesitated a moment, then unlocked the door and went inside. I stood across the street, hidden behind a tall hedge. The neighborhood was quiet, only the faint hum of a radio drifting from an open window somewhere. I waited, unsure what I expected, maybe to see her come out again, maybe to see some trace of Henry in that doorway. After several minutes, the curtain in the front window stirred, a soft light flickered on. Through the thin lace, I could just make out shapes, the curve of furniture, the gleam of framed photos. My eyes strained to focus, and I edged closer, peering from the hedge's shadow. Then I saw it. On the wall, half lit by the lamp, hung a photograph. Henry, smiling. Not the older Henry I'd buried, but the younger one, dark hair, bright eyes, the dimple I used to tease him about. He stood beside the woman in the gray coat, his arm draped around her shoulders. They looked happy, comfortable, familiar. My breath caught. I leaned in, squinting through the glass, but there was no mistaking it. The tilt of his head, the small scar near his temple. It was him, my husband, my Henry, and he was smiling in someone else's home. The world went quiet, except for the faint sound of the radio still playing somewhere, an old love song, slow and sweet, twisting like a knife. I pressed my hand to my mouth to stop the sob that wanted to escape. My mind flooded with questions, each one louder than the last. Had he lived another life before me, another love, or had he kept this woman hidden, a secret folded neatly into the years we shared? I felt dizzy. The pavement seemed to tilt beneath me. I gripped the hedge for balance and stared at the house, my eyes burning. She moved through the room, setting something on a table. Maybe the flowers, maybe that pendant. Then she sat down, facing the window. For a brief, terrible moment, I thought she saw me, but she didn't. She simply stared into space, her face soft with memory, as if she were speaking to someone long gone. I stepped back, heart pounding, afraid the sound of my breathing might give me away. The rain began to fall then, soft at first, then heavier, blurring the glass, smudging the outline of their photograph until it was only color and shadow. I turned away. My shoes splashed through puddles as I walked back down the street, the cold soaking through my coat. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay there another second. By the time I reached home, the sky had turned to slate. I peeled off my wet coat and stood in the hallway, the air heavy with silence. My reflection stared back at me from the hall mirror, older, smaller, a woman who'd loved and lost twice in one lifetime. I thought of Henry's laugh, his gentle eyes, the stories he never finished telling. Maybe the truth didn't belong to me anymore. Maybe it never had. But one thought anchored me, bitter and certain. That pendant, that compass, was still in her house, and I couldn't rest until I knew how it got there. I looked toward the window, where the rain streaked down like tears. My voice came out, barely a whisper. This isn't over, Henry. Not yet. I spent the next few days in a fog, replaying the photo in my mind. I called my daughter Sarah, vaguely mentioning a strange discovery at the grave. But she was busy with the grandchildren, and promised to visit soon. It helped a little, grounding me in the family Henry and I had built over 40 years. Finally, I left a note at the cemetery the following week, folded neatly beneath the flowers. Please meet me. I need to understand. When the knock came, it wasn't loud, just a soft, hesitant rhythm against the wood. Polite, almost apologetic. I stood in the doorway, and the woman from the graveyard, the one with the gray coat and the compass, looked smaller than I remembered. Her eyes were gentle, cautious. I'm Helen, she said quietly. May I come in? I nodded before my voice could betray me. We sat in the living room where the afternoon light fell in stripes across the carpet. I made tea, out of habit, though neither of us touched it. The air between us felt fragile, full of questions I was afraid to ask. She spoke first. I never meant to hurt you. Her voice trembled slightly, but her gaze didn't waver. Henry and we knew each other long before you did. I stiffened. She continued, her fingers wrapped tightly around her cup. We were young, foolish, maybe. He wanted to marry me once, but life, it went a different way. My parents moved, his mother fell ill, and letters stopped being enough. By the time I came back, he had met you. The words hit like small stones. I stared at the photograph on the mantel, our wedding day, and felt the edges of my world tilt. After your children grew up, Sarah and Tom, right? He wrote to me again. It started with birthdays, condolences, old jokes, then memories, just ... memories. I wanted to be angry, but her eyes held no malice, only sorrow. He never stopped loving you. she whispered. But he couldn't let go of me either. Not completely. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The clock ticked faintly. Outside, a sparrow landed on the window ledge, pecked once, and flew away. So there was no affair, I said finally. She shook her head. No, nothing like that. We met twice, both times after he was diagnosed with cancer, about 5 years ago. He said he wanted to remember the parts of his life that still felt alive. She hesitated, then added, he talked about you constantly, how you made the garden bloom again, how you laughed even when he couldn't. Tears stung my eyes. Then why hide it? Because he was ashamed, she said simply. He thought it would break you to know. He wanted to protect you from the pieces of himself he couldn't tidy away. I pressed my hand to my chest, as if to steady the hollow opening there. Protect me, I whispered, more to myself than to her. He lied to me for years, and that was his way of protecting me. Helen looked down, her voice a thread. Sometimes love tries too hard to be kind. The room blurred for a moment. I could smell the tea cooling, the faint trace of lilies from her coat, and then she reached into her bag and placed a small wooden box on the table between us. I think this belongs to you, she said. It was small enough to fit in my hands, old, polished, smooth, the kind of box made to hold something fragile. Inside were letters, folded, yellowed, tied with a faded ribbon, my name written on the topmost one in Henry's familiar, slanted handwriting. Helen stood to leave, but paused in the doorway. He never sent them, she said. He wrote them after each visit. Said one day you might need to know who he was when you weren't looking. And about the compass, he gave me the original after he lost it briefly and you replaced it. He said it reminded him of paths not taken. Then she was gone. I sat for a long time before opening the first letter. My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, it means time has finally caught up with me. I have loved you with everything I had, but I've also carried parts of my past I never managed to bury. I wish I'd been brave enough to tell you that Helen wrote to me, not because I wanted another life, but because I wanted to remember the man I used to be. The ink had bled slightly at the edges. My tears did the rest. He wrote of guilt, of fear, of gratitude, of how he'd wake in the night and listen to my breathing just to remind himself that he'd chosen right, of how he'd kept Helen's first letter tucked inside an old book, not as temptation, but as proof that love can survive in more than one form. I wanted to tell you that loving her never took anything from you. It only reminded me how precious you were. You were my home, Eleanor, always you. I pressed the letter to my lips, trembling. His words hurt more than his silence ever did. Another letter, shorter. If you ever meet her, be kind. She reminds me of who I was before I learned how fragile people can be. I cried until I couldn't anymore. The house seemed to breathe with me, old wood creaking softly, as though even the walls understood. When the last letter slipped from my hands, the ribbon came undone and scattered across the table like a surrender. I stared at them, his truths, his apologies, and realized that I wasn't angry anymore, just unbearably sad. Love had betrayed me, yes, but it had also tethered me to something beautiful, something human. By morning, I knew what I had to do. The cemetery looked different that day, brighter somehow, softer. Spring had fully arrived, the grass alive with color. The air was cool but not cold, the kind that promises peace if you stay long enough to listen. I carried 2 bouquets this time, one of chrysanthemums, one of lilies. Helen was already there, standing quietly near the grave, her coat pulled close around her. When she saw me, she started to speak, but I raised a hand. It's all right, I said. My voice surprised me, steady, almost calm. I read the letters. She nodded, eyes shining. I hoped you would. We stood there in silence for a while, side by side, 2 women bound by the same man, the same ache. Then I knelt and placed my bouquet chrysanthemums first, then lilies beside mine. For the first time, I said softly, I didn't visit his grave to cry. I came to forgive. Helen knelt to her hand, brushing against mine. Neither of us pulled away. I used to think forgiveness was a gift you gave the other person, I murmured. But maybe it's the one thing you do for yourself. She smiled faintly. He would have liked that. We stayed until the sun began to set, watching the light shift across the headstone. The wind carried the scent of the flowers, gentle and fleeting. I thought of Henry then, his laughter, his letters. The compass, he said, always pointed home. For the first time, I realized that home wasn't a place, or even a person. It was a truth, messy, imperfect, but real. Helen rose to leave, her movements slow, thoughtful. Before she turned, she pressed something into my hand, the compass. Its metal was cool, the glass scratched but still clear. He wanted you to have it, she said. Said you'd know when to let it point you forward. When she was gone, I stood alone by the grave. The setting sun painted the sky in strokes of gold and violet. I felt the breeze against my face, soft, forgiving. I whispered, "Goodbye, my love." And for the first time, it didn't feel like loss. It felt like release. I placed the compass at the base of the headstone, where it caught the last light of the day, gleaming faintly as if alive. Then I walked away, slow, steady, each step lighter than the one before. Behind me, the flowers stirred in the wind, their colors mingling white and gold, past and present, two lives, two loves, resting in peace together. It was Helen's idea to bring pastries. I had only meant to offer tea, something simple, quiet, but when she arrived that afternoon, arms full of a paper bag dusted with sugar and sunlight, it felt right. The kettle whistled softly as I set out the cups. The kitchen smelled of chamomile and cinnamon, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel like a guest in my own home. Still using the same teapot? Helen asked with a gentle smile, running a finger along the cracked porcelain rim. Henry bought it on our first trip to Brighton, I said it reminded him of sunlight. She laughed softly. He said the same thing to me once, only it was about a scarf. For a heartbeat, we both froze. Then, to my surprise, we laughed, not cruelly, not awkwardly, just honestly, as if the absurdity of it all had finally found its voice. We sat across from each other like old friends, pretending we'd always known how to do this, share space, share memories, share him. The tension that once knotted my chest was gone. What remained was a curious tenderness. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me again," Helen said after a while. "I wasn't sure either," I admitted, "but grief makes you lonely, and lonely people tend to reach for those who understand." She nodded, stirring her tea, though she hadn't added sugar. "It's strange, isn't it, to love the same man, and somehow still have kindness left for each other?" I thought about that, watching the steam rise between us. "Maybe that's what love does," I said. "It stretches until it finds a new shape." Helen's eyes softened. "He used to talk about your garden, said the marigolds always turned toward you, even when you weren't looking." I smiled, feeling the warmth of memory instead of its sting. "And he told me once that you made the best lemon tarts in Yorkshire." She laughed again. He wasn't wrong, though I suspect he said it to keep me cooking. We ate the pastries she'd brought, flaky, sweet, full of quiet joy. Between bites, we spoke of Henry, not as possession or wound, but as memory. She told me about their first dance at a church social, about a letter he wrote her when he was 20, and certain of everything. I told her about the first time I saw him cry, the night our youngest, Tom, left home and the house grew too quiet. We shared his stories like fragments of a mirror, each piece reflecting a version of him we'd known. At one point, Helen reached across the table and touched my hand. "You know," she said, "we both lost him, but somehow, we both kept him too." That single sentence cracked something open in me. For the first time, I could hold both truths without pain, that Henry had belonged to us both, and yet, entirely to himself. When the tea cooled, and the light softened to gold, I poured us another cup. We spoke of ordinary things, recipes, books, the ache in our knees when it rained. The world felt small and merciful again, before she left. We stood by the garden gate, watching the marigolds sway. "I'd like to visit the grave again," Helen said, "if you don't mind." "Not at all," I said. "We can go together next Sunday." Her face lit with something close to relief. "Together," she repeated. That night, as I washed the cups and set them to dry, I realized how peace doesn't come with time, it comes with choice. And I had finally chosen it. The following Sunday, the sky was soft with clouds, the air heavy with the promise of rain. We walked slowly, side by side, the path familiar now, almost comforting. Helen carried lilies, I brought chrysanthemums. Again, we didn't speak much. The silence between us had grown companionable, like the hush of an old song. At the grave, we placed the flowers together. The wind picked up just then, carrying the scent of soil and blossoms, and I felt something gentle settle inside me, not sorrow, but gratitude. We stayed a while, tidying the space, brushing away leaves. When it began to drizzle, Helen pulled her coat tighter and looked at me. "Do you ever talk to him?" she asked. "Every day," I said, "though sometimes I think he's tired of listening." She chuckled. "Then maybe today, we can talk to him together." So we did. 2 women, 2 stories, one love. We spoke aloud, not of loss, but of continuity. How he would have laughed at us sharing recipes. How he'd never believed we'd sit together peacefully at his grave. When we left, I glanced back once. The compass I'd placed weeks ago was still there, glinting faintly under the gray light. I imagined it turning, not north, but toward whatever comes next. A few weeks later, I decided to record something for my grandchildren. Not a confession, not a sermon, just a message. Sarah had suggested it during her last visit, saying the kids would treasure hearing my voice one day. I set up the old camcorder on the kitchen table, its red light blinking patiently. I sat where the morning light came through the lace curtains, warm and forgiving. I took a deep breath and smiled. "Hello, my loves," I began. "I suppose by the time you see this, I'll be old enough to forget how to work the camera, or gone enough that it doesn't matter." I laughed softly, but I wanted to tell you a story. I told them about love, not the grand, cinematic kind, but the quiet kind that grows in corners of long days and shared silences. About how their grandfather had a heart too big for one lifetime, and how that wasn't a flaw but a mark of being human. "There will be times," I said, "when you'll feel betrayed, or broken, or left behind. But don't let pride make you lonely. Forgive quickly, love fully, and never let silence last longer than it needs to." My voice trembled then, but I kept going. "You see, love doesn't end at the grave, it only changes hands. One day, you'll understand that grief isn't the opposite of love. It's shadow proof that something real once stood in the light." I paused, looking out the window where the marigolds were blooming again. Helen had been by earlier that morning. She'd brought new soil, said the plants deserved a second chance. "I used to think life was about keeping people," I continued, "but it's really about keeping meaning. Every person you love becomes a part of the story you leave behind." I leaned closer to the camera. "If you remember anything from this old woman's ramblings, remember this. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing peace over pride. Choose peace, my darlings, again and again." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The clock ticked faintly. I thought of Henry, of Helen, of the strange, beautiful way our lives had woven together like threads from the same cloth. Finally, I smiled. "Tell your children about us one day," I said softly. "Tell them their grandfather was flawed and funny and full of love, and that their grandmother learned that forgiveness is just another word for freedom." I reached out and turned off the camera. The red light blinked once, then disappeared. Outside, Helen was waiting by the gate with her walking stick. Together, we walked down the lane toward the cemetery. Two old women moving slowly through the golden light. We carried fresh flowers, hers white, mine yellow. The camera, still warm, sat on the table behind us, recording nothing now except the faint echo of laughter and peace. And as we reached the grave, the breeze rose gently around us, carrying petals into the air. I heard her murmur something, maybe a prayer, maybe just Henry's name. I whispered mine too. We placed the flowers side by side, their colors mingling like old stories retold. When we turned to leave, I didn't look back this time. The compass would still be there, pointing us forward, always forward.